In 1876, India was feeding the world. Not metaphorically, literally. Ships loaded with rice and wheat left Indian ports every single week, bound for Britain, bound for Europe, bound for markets thousands of miles away. And while those ships sailed, 6 million people starved to death. This is not a story about drought. This is not a story about bad harvests. This is a story about a system so calculated, so deliberate, so protected by paperwork and policy, that when the truth finally surfaced, the people responsible had already retired with honors. And the record was sealed. What you are about to hear has been buried inside colonial archives for over a century. Most history books in the Western world give it half a paragraph, if that. So stay with me, because by the end of this, you will understand something about power that they never wanted you to know. In the 1870s, the Deccan Plateau in southern India was one of the most agriculturally productive regions on Earth. The farmers here had worked this land for generations. They grew sorghum, millet, rice, pulses, enough to feed their families, enough to trade, enough to survive lean years. But Britain had restructured the entire Indian economy around one thing: export, cotton for British mills, grain for British markets. And Indian farmers, taxed heavily, land revenue demands non-negotiable, had no choice but to grow what the empire needed, not what their families needed. Then in 1876, the monsoon failed. The rains did not come. The soil cracked. The wells dropped. And across Madras Presidency, Bombay, Mysore, Hyderabad, crops withered in the ground. This was the Great Famine of 1876. It would eventually kill between 6 and 10 million people. But here is where the story stops being about the weather. Because the grain was still there. India's granaries were not empty. The grain stores existed. The food existed. And it was leaving. In 1876 alone, at the height of the famine, Britain exported a record amount of wheat from India. Not a small shipment. A record. Ships queued at Bombay Harbor. Indian dock workers, the same men whose villages were starving, loaded those ships. They loaded the grain. They watched it sail. And they went home to nothing. The man responsible for India at this moment was Viceroy Lord Lytton, a poet, a Victorian aristocrat, a man who believed, in writing, that famine relief for Indians was a sentimental mistake that would disrupt the free market. He said, and I want you to hear this clearly, that the Indian population had a tendency to increase beyond the means of subsistence. He wrote that. He believed that. And he acted on it. When provincial administrators begged him to halt grain exports, he refused. When local officials asked to stockpile food inside India, he refused. When the evidence of mass starvation arrived in his office, he was busy planning a party. In January 1877, while 6 million people were dying across southern and central India, Lord Lytton organized the Imperial Assemblage in Delhi. You need to picture this: an enormous ceremonial event, the largest imperial spectacle ever staged on Indian soil. 60,000 people attended. Elephants in ceremonial gold regalia, British military in full red dress uniform, Indian princes in jeweled court dress, banners, brass bands, a formal proclamation declaring Queen Victoria Empress of India. The feast to celebrate that proclamation cost the colonial government a sum that would have funded months of famine relief. The celebration lasted days. Outside Delhi, people were dying on the roads. Inside the Durbar, they were pouring champagne. This was not coincidence. This was a choice. When pressure finally forced Lytton to establish famine relief camps, he made sure they could not actually save people. The camps required labor. Starving people, men with visible ribs, women carrying infants, were required to perform hard physical work on public construction sites in exchange for food. The daily calorie ration Lytton approved for famine camp workers was lower than the ration given to prisoners in Nazi concentration camps in World War II. That comparison was made by historian Mike Davis, not by activists, by a historian. With the numbers, people who were too weak to work were denied rations entirely. The very old, the very young, the sick, they received nothing. And when the camps became overcrowded and disease spread, Lytton closed them, not because the famine was over, because the optics were becoming inconvenient. There were people who saw this, who said something. Indian journalists published the grain export figures. They named the ships. They named the ports. They named the dates. They were prosecuted. Not the officials, the journalists. A British colonial official named William Digby compiled the mortality statistics, the real numbers, and published them. Florence Nightingale wrote privately that British policy in India was manufactured famine. She did not say this publicly. She was afraid of what would happen if she did. One British member of Parliament, William Wedderburn, stood in the House of Commons and demanded an investigation. He was dismissed. No investigation followed. No official was removed. No policy changed. When the famine finally ended, not because of British intervention, but because the monsoon returned, the grain exports resumed at full volume. The empire moved on. By 1878, the villages of the Deccan Plateau were half empty. Entire communities had been erased. The farming families who survived returned to land they could no longer work because the cattle were dead, the tools were gone, the seeds were eaten. They found graves where their neighbors had been, and they found British administrative buildings, still standing, still staffed, still processing paperwork, as if nothing had happened. The official death toll from the Great Famine of 1876 was recorded by the British colonial government as approximately 5 million. Independent historians using the same census data calculate the real number at closer to 10 million. The difference, 5 million human beings, was simply not counted, not misplaced, not lost in translation, not counted, because counting them would have required acknowledging what had been done. And here is what the history books do not tell you. This was not the only famine. 1770, 1783, 1866, 1873, 1876, 1896, 1899, 1943. Under 2 centuries of British rule, India experienced famine on a scale the subcontinent had never seen under Mughal rule, under earlier dynasties, under any prior period. Pre-colonial India had famines, but not like this, not engineered ones. Nobel laureate economist Amartya Sen, born in Bengal, where the last Great Famine killed 3 million in 1943, spent his life studying why famines happen. His conclusion was devastating. Famines do not occur because food does not exist. Famines occur when people are denied access to food that exists. Every famine under British India fits that definition. Every single one. The man who organized the feast while millions starved, Lord Lytton, returned to Britain, was celebrated, was given a state funeral when he died. His portrait still hangs in institutional buildings. His name is still on plaques. No official apology has ever been issued by the British government for the Great Famine of 1876. Not one word. The grain export records are in the British National Archives. The ship manifests are there. The mortality ledgers are there. The evidence is complete, cataloged, and accessible, and the silence around it has been chosen. Every story on this channel exists because someone decided the record should stay buried. This one has been buried for 150 years. If this reached you, if you made it to the end of this, you are now one of the people who knows. And that matters. Drop the name of your country in the comments right now, because I want to know where in the world this truth is landing. And there is a story from your country's history that this channel needs to tell next. If you are watching on Facebook, follow this page. If you found this on YouTube, subscribe, because the next story is already being prepared, and it is worse than this one. The only reason these stories disappear is because not enough people share them. One share does not feel like much, but every person who sees this because you shared it is one more person the silence did not win. Share this. They counted on you forgetting. Prove them wrong.